All right, we are here today on Sunday, the 12th of June in 2011 at the Limerick-Hackett Post 72 of the American Legion, 30 John Street, Saugerties, New York, 12477. And we are interviewing Mr. William W. Hook. He is a veteran of both World War II and Korea, and he served in the United States Marine Corps. So, Mr. Hook, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Yep. My pleasure.
Yep. So we'll start our interview. We discussed some of these questions before. Let's see. Were you drafted or did you enlist?
No, I enlisted at the age of 17 with my mother's permission.
And where were you living at the time?
In New York City.
New York City.
59th and 8th Avenue.
59th and 8th Avenue?
9th Avenue, excuse me.
59th and 9th Avenue.
53rd and 9th Avenue.
53rd and 9th Avenue. Okay. Why did you join?
Why did I join? I had been in the Merchant Marine before that, and I was making big bucks. And my brother had enlisted in the Marine Corps in May of 1942. So I felt a little embarrassed that my older brother, who was making 21 bucks a month, and I was making over $500 a month. So I enlisted on August 1st, 1942.
And why did you pick that branch of the service?
Because of my brother.
The Marines, okay. Do you recall your very first days of service? How was that?
Oh yeah, we, I think it was number 1 Church Street in New York City where I enlisted. And they put us on the ferry, sent us over to Hoboken, got on a train and rode down to Paris Island, which was, I took about 24 hours. It was a great trip, great trip.
And you got to Paris Island in the summer. It's pretty warm down there.
It was very, very, very hot, sticky, and a lot of mosquitoes.
And so what did it feel like being in the service down there all of a sudden?
It felt great because I can't remember our drill sergeant's name, but he was fantastic, and he pushed us and he helped us a great deal. He was absolutely great. I had the worst time trying to qualify for bayonet training. Yeah. And one night I was out there practicing by moonlight, and he came out on the field and he said, "There's no way you're not going to qualify." He says, "Tomorrow we'll run through this again, and I know you're going to do great." And I did qualify.
Anything else you'd like to tell us about boot camp that you can remember? Sticks in your hands out?
I felt like I was becoming a man very quickly, very quickly. And
as I mentioned earlier, you served in World War II, and you served in the beginning part of the Korean War. You tell us that you went overseas. Where else did you serve in the States before you went overseas?
Well, when I got out of boot camp, I went to Quantico, Virginia, and I was assigned to the signal battalion there. And they asked the first question, "Would you want to go to radio school?" And all we heard was how difficult it was to be in radio school, drumming this dots and dashes, where you had some of the guys that actually went off the deep end, and I said, I don't want radio school. And they said, "Well, how about telephone school?" And I said, "No, that's too close to radio. I don't want that." And they said, "Okay, how about mess duty then?" so I went on mess duty, and we were in Quantico for about I think 2 or 3 months, and then we moved to Hadnot Point, North Carolina, at Camp Lejeune, and we were, I do believe, the very first unit to go into Hadnot Point in Camp Lejeune. And Tent City was open, but Hadnot Point, it was just opening, and we were the first unit to go in there. And guess where I went? Back in the mess hall. And from there, I did a number of different things, and they in 1943, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., who was the lieutenant commander in the Navy, had gone over to England, and he discovered this these organizations which were diversionary organizations, and he was fascinated by it. So he said, well, we're going to implement this kind of diversionary, these kind of diversionary organizations in the U.S. Military, and him being Navy, he thought of the Marines. So they asked for volunteers. It was a top secret organization. They asked for volunteers, and I was anxious to get over and do something for my country, so I volunteered, and shipped out in the summer of 1943 to New Caledonia for a while, and the trip over was an interesting thing. It was only, I think there was 69 of us in the whole unit, and most of the guys in this unit were actually Hollywood types that Douglas Fairbanks Jr. Had gone to and said, "Hey, you're making big bucks in Hollywood. Now you're going to be a technician in the Marine Corps, and you might become a corporal or a sergeant." So he had all these guys with technical experience in sound equipment, and that was the big thing. We created sounds of wartime happenings, and so we went overseas to first to Noumea for a very short time. Then we went up to Guadalcanal. This was after Guadalcanal had been secured. September of 1943, I believe it was. And our first mission would have been on Bougainville. And we were training there on Guadalcanal, and we were assigned to a mission which was not very pleasant, because I would have gone ashore 24 hours before H hour in rubber boats. We operated off PT boats, and I would have gone ashore with two other guys who were sound technicians, and we were going to set up equipment on the beach, representing small arms fire to draw the enemy over to our side of the island. And in the last briefing, before the operation actually existed, Admiral Halsey was very concerned about the safety of the three guys that were on the beach, and he said, "No, I don't want that. I don't want these guys having to flounder around." And he essentially scratched the beach jumper unit number 1 off the charts altogether, and that was the end of the unit.
You had mentioned earlier when we talked about the fact that there was supposed to be a submarine to pick you up, and the Admiral said he hadn't seen a requisition for the submarine.
Yes, and I didn't want to tell that.
Don't.
Okay, I didn't want to tell that story. But in fact, we were to have been evacuated by submarine, and for some reason or other, the submarine did not get requisition, and Admiral Halsey was very concerned. He says, "We don't waste 3 men, no matter who they are." And
the unit was called beach jumpers. Huh?
Right, that's right. So that organization was scrapped, and then I ended up in a casual company unloading ships for a while, and a friend of mine had been tapped to do a job as a runner between offices, and he didn't like it at all. And I said, "Geez, that sounds like that beats unloading ships, and I'd like to see if I can get that job if you don't want it." And he didn't want it. He clearly didn't want it. So the colonel interviewed me, Colonel Gale T. Cummings, who was one of the greatest men I've ever met. I loved him dearly. He was toward the end of his career in the Marine Corps. He was in his 50s, I guess. He was a great guy, and so I got a job as a runner, running from one office to the other. Colonel Cummings was the G1 of the 3rd Amphibious Corps. And the 3rd Amphibious Corps is a very, very small headquarters unit. And the only people really assigned to the 3rd Amphibious Corps was General Roy S. Geiger, who was the commanding general. And the chief staff at that time was Colonel Salzman. And Colonel Cummings was the G1 officer, which is the personnel activities in the division. Then they had the G2, G3, G4, and G5. They were the only ones really assigned to the 3rd Amphibious Corps. The rest of us were assigned to Headquarters and Service Battalion, and we worked for these colonels. And shortly after I became a runner, for some reason, I forget what it was, the colonel's driver had moved on to something else, and the colonel asked me if I wanted to be his driver, and I said, yeah, absolutely. So I became his driver, and we were we had a great team. There was Colonel, the closest people in that organization to me were Colonel Cummings, Eddie Kuntz, Lieutenant Eddie Kuntz, who was a great guy. He had been a broadcaster in Oklahoma City, and he was a really wonderful guy, first lieutenant, great guy. Nick Breen was a wonderful Irishman from New York City, and he was the colonel's orderly. And we kind of formed a team, and whenever we were in the forward area, the first operation we had, the 3rd Amphibious Corps was just forming at that point. And interestingly enough, I'm not sure how this fits into it, but the 4th Marine Regiment had been in the legation in Shanghai, or Peking, I guess it was, and they were made to surrender in 1941 when the war began, and they lost their colors. It was the only Marine unit that ever lost its colors. So they wanted to reform the 4th Marine Regiment on Guadalcanal, which became part of the 6th Marine Division, which became part of the 3rd Amphibious Corps. And they reformed the organization without colors. And consequently, when we went into combat on Guam, the 4th Marines, a very prominent organization in that battle, won their colors back. So that was a great thing. Guam was an interesting thing, and I gotta tell you a little bit about one incident on Guam. It was a tough battle. The Corps headquarters is not a combat unit. But however, we frequently go to the front lines. In our case, to pick up information about casualties and all sorts of things like that. And Colonel Cummings was a very daring guy. And one of his responsibilities was to select sites for future ammunition dumps and division headquarters, corps headquarters, and all that. So consequently, some of the times we would be wandering behind enemy lines, scouting out places that would be of interest for later use. And the way we'd go was Colonel Cummings and I was the driver, he was with me, and Nick Breen and Eddie Kuntz would be in the back seat, and they were riding shotgun. So we never really ran into anything behind the lines, but we did have some interesting things. Like when we were on Okinawa, I jumped ahead a little bit. We were at Shuri Castle the day before, it was taken by us. But jumping back to Guam, though, and going behind enemy lines. In the election campaign that took place in 1944, I guess it was, a colonel was sent out from headquarters Marine Corps, to collect the information from the troops on the election. And when he came in, Colonel Cummings said, "Well, you know, you can use my driver. He can take you down to some of the units and show you what's going on and everything." And one day, I don't want to mention his name. One day, we were out, and I was to take the colonel to the front lines to get some information on the voting, upcoming general election. And Colonel, before I left, Colonel Cummings called me into the office and he said, let's look at the battle map. Let's look at the battle plan here. You see, here's an area that we're going to be taking sometime later today. He says, but if you're down in this frontline unit, he said, you can come back down this road here, which is behind the enemy lines, and there's a good chance you can get back here before we run into the skirmish. So I said, oh, okay, great. So I didn't tell the colonel that I was driving about that part, but on our way back, all of a sudden, here we begin to hear, I'm coming down this road behind enemy lines, and we hear small arms fire. So I said, Colonel, the M1 is here. You better take it in case we need it, and hold on, I'm not going to stop for anything. We're going like a bat out of hell. And so we get down this road, and as we cleared this one area, we start seeing the Japanese falling back across that road, and we get back, and he said, how did that happen? How did we get into this stuff? And I said, well, Colonel Cummings had suggested that we might want to take this route on the way back because we didn't think we were going to be there'd be any combat going on along that time. So so we got back to the Corps headquarters, and this colonel was bursting into the office, complaining to Colonel Cummings, and he said, "No, this guy took me behind enemy lines and everything. Damn, they got killed and everything. The Japs are over there." And Colonel Cummings said, "It'll never happen again. Because from now on, you draw the Jeep from the motor pool and try to pick up a driver, and that's it. But you won't get billed again." The reason I tell this story is funny because after the voting part was over, this colonel became the commanding officer of the headquarters and service battalion of the 3rd Amphibious Corps. So he was my boss now all of a sudden. And he and I had some very interesting skirmishes along the way. At one point, I was up for promotion from PFC to corporal. And Eddie Kuntz, the first lieutenant, happened to get a copy of the promotion list, the promotion roster, and I was not on it. And he called this colonel on the telephone and said, PFC Hook's name is not on here for promotion to corporal, and he said, I just want to tell you that this would make Colonel Cummings very unhappy if his name, if this promotion list comes out tomorrow morning and he's not on it. And the colonel then relented, and guess what? I was promoted. Now here's a first lieutenant literally dictating to a lieutenant colonel. And that did not help my personal situation, because this guy and I had a few more skirmishes later on. We'll come back to that. That was an interesting thing. From Guam, we set up headquarters then in Guam.
Okay.
We moved our headquarters from Guadalcanal to Guam, and then from there we launched the operation against the Japanese in Okinawa.
Now, while we're on Guam,
Yeah.
I'd just like to show this photo because it really is appropriate to bring it in now. And actually, I think we could maybe do these two first. Let's go with this one here. You mentioned Mr. Breen.
Yeah, that's Nick.
Okay,
Nick
can you
is
zoom in on that?
Oh, yeah.
So on the left is Corporal Hook.
Yeah,
I mean, Corporal,
yeah.
And Corporal
Corporal Breen, yeah.
Breen. Okay.
Who was the colonel's orderly.
Yeah.
We were close friends.
Was he a corporal too? Was he?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, he was
What was
close.
his first name?
Nick.
Nick Breen.
Nicholas.
Nick Breen.
Nicholas J. Breen.
Okay. I see you got your Marine Corps leggings on there. Huh?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, and Nick was a little casual there.
Yeah, he was pretty good. Now that's the U.S. government issued skin, right? You got the shirt.
All right, yeah, right, yeah.
Now, please tell us about this picture. This is a very interesting story about your dad and so forth.
Yeah, well, yeah. What happened was we were down at on the front
Oh, yeah,
lines.
good, yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
We were down on the front lines one day, where our troops had just taken over this village, and so Colonel Cummings was talking to the village people, the leaders in the village and everything, and was asking if everything was all right and is there any way we could be of any help.
Yeah.
And he said, well, we have these two little girls who are very, very sick. They have very high fever and everything, and we're concerned about them. And Colonel said, well, we'll take them to our field hospital and we'll get them all fixed up. So I was carrying one, and one of the sergeants who was in our publicity organization within the Marine Corps, he was carrying the other girl, and so his cameraman sees us coming and he starts rolling the thing, and eventually we didn't realize it, but it got in the Movietone News. This shot got in the Movietone News, and my father, who was in the Air Force at the time, he was a butcher in the Air Force in New Haven, Connecticut. He drank a little bit, and he was out on. We went to the movies one night, and he sees this Movietone News thing before the film started. They always started the news first, and he sees this shot. And he's, "That's my son! That's my son!" And he made a tremendous commotion in the theater, and the manager of the theater came down and he said, "You gotta be quiet, you gotta be quiet." He said, "That's my son, that's my son." That's all he could say. And he says, "Come with me." And he took him up to the projection booth, and he said, "Let's look, we'll look fine, look through here." And they cut out a couple clips of this thing, and they gave him copies, and they made a news story out of it, and it ended up in the newspaper. That's how that picture came to be. And the two little girls recovered very, very nicely, and we took them back to their village, and everything was fine.
And then you mentioned it. Then you went on to Okinawa.
Then we went on to Okinawa, and when we landed on Guam, I think I went ashore on the third day of the battle. Thank God, because when we landed on Guam, where we happened to land, we got pushed back. Our troops got pushed back in the ocean the first 2 nights, and I was glad I was not a combat Marine at that time. But then we went on to Okinawa on Easter Sunday, 1945, and I went ashore in the first wave, and because we knew that where we were going ashore, there was nobody. The Army caught hell further south, and it seemed like the Divide 9 27th Army they really got the crap kicked out of them on the landing. But we walked ashore, and we walked ashore, and we were at Kadena Air Force Base, and took it by noon, and we spent the night we spent the night there, and we had shell fire that night. But that's about all. And the early part of the Okinawa operation, the Marines was assigned to the northern portion, the Army was the southern portion, and we literally walked through the north, and then we joined the Army and pushed down south. And as I mentioned, we sometimes wandered behind the enemy lines, and one day we were behind enemy lines looking for site for, I think, for an future ammunition dump. And we were at Shuri Castle down in the south the day before our troops took it. And as a matter of fact, we went back to our lines, and we told Colonel Cummings was advising the officers about the terrain and everything. And lo and behold, the next day we were back there, and Shuri Castle was rubble. It was really a terrible thing.
Shuri Castle was really the headquarters for the Japanese commanders' resistance, I think.
Yeah, it was a very high point. It was a very high point above the capital city, Naha, and it's not far from where commanding general, Army commanding general, what was his name?
Was it Buckner?
Buckner, yeah, Simon Bolivar Buckner. He was the commanding general of the 10th Army, which was the commanding unit, and he was killed shortly thereafter by enemy fire, which was a tragedy. And General Geiger then took over the 10th Army. He was put place in command of the 10th Army. And a little bit later, shortly after I left Okinawa on July 4th, 1945, went back to Guam. And shortly after that, General Geiger was promoted to commanding general of the Fleet Marine Force Pacific, and Keller E. Rocky, the Major General at that time, took over the 3rd Amphibious Corps. He had been previously, he was the commanding general of the 5th Amphibious Corps, which caught hell on the Iwo Jima. So where we go?
Well, we're moving on to North China.
Oh yeah, okay.
Tell me about North China.
Well, shortly, and mind you, my brother was in the Marine Corps. He saw combat on Guadalcanal in the 1st Marine Division. And then he went back to the States. And after a while, he came back out and was in Hawaii. And in July of 1945, I had talked to the colonel and said, my brother and I have never seen each other in uniform at the same time. And he's stationed on Guam. And Colonel Cummings said, no problem. He said, we're going to send you to temporary duty for 3 weeks in his outfit. And so I said, that's great. So the orders cut and everything. I was going to be flying out to Hawaii to spend 3 weeks with my brother. And I got the night before I was supposed to leave for Hawaii, I was summoned to the office by Colonel Cummings. And he said, now look, he said, I got to tell you, by the way, the war was over then. The war had come to an end.
The war had come to an end.
And while we were there. And he said, Colonel Cummings said, you know, he said, I know you're flying off to Hawaii tomorrow. He says, but another assignment's come up. He said, and I'm going to give you your choice. He said, frankly, he says, I'm going back to the States. I'll be leaving for the States soon. Eddie Kuntz is going to be going back also. Nick Breen is going back also. I'm turning over command temporarily to Colonel Crawford, who is an interesting guy. I tell you a little bit about Colonel Crawford. But Brigadier General Wharton was now the Chief of Staff of 3rd Amphibious Corps, and he is going to go into North China to work with the Japanese to arrange for the rest of our troops to come in a bit later, and eventually we will accept the surrender of North China from the Japanese. And General Wharton and 10 other high-ranking officers and 6 enlisted men are going to go into North China. And Colonel Crawford gets to pick one, and he picked you. And so he said, "So you have your choice." And I said, "Well, you know, duty first. You know, I'm sorry that you and I are parting companies, and I just wish you the very, very best of everything as you terminate your career in the Marine Corps." And but I can't. Colonel Crawford wants me to go with him. I'm on. So then we went on the 18th of September of 1945. We took off in 2 aircraft, a DC-3 and a C-47. This is what the Army called it. RD-4. And we took off in these 2 aircraft. We landed at Okinawa for refueling, and then we flew into Shanghai. And as we flew into Shanghai, the first thing we did was we made a pass over the field, and it had a few pockmarks in it. So we cautiously landed both the aircraft and rode around those bomb craters. And we stayed at 2 hotels in Shanghai, and Sally and I visited these hotels last year. The one is now known as the Peace Hotel. At that time, it was the Cathay Hotel, and it was a very old hotel, beautiful, absolutely wonderful. And General Wharton stayed there. And right across the road from there, across the street from there, is the what was then the Palace Hotel. It's now part hotel and part stores at the bottom level. Then both of those buildings are still there today. And I recognize very much about Peace Hotel. But we were there for 3 days. We were there for 3 days, and while we were there, General Wharton took both of the aircraft and flew to Chongqing, which was the headquarters for General Albert Wiedemeyer, Army General, who was in command of U.S. command of all of China. And so General Wharton, who had been a China Marine before, he served 10 years on active duty, and sometimes in a kind of a spy mode in China before. So he knew China, and so he went out to Chongqing to report into General Wiedemeyer, and took both planes with him. We wondered why he took both planes, and discovered that the reason he needed both planes was because he had taken $1 million in cash with him, U.S., $1 million, and converted it into the currency that was in effect at that time, and it was 10 cases, which was this high and about that wide, and they were huge things, and he needed 2 planes to carry this $1 million worth of stuff. While the rest of us, we languished around Shanghai for 3 days, and we had a ball. First of all, we were working at the expense of the Japanese Army, the Japanese military. We reported to the Japanese military, and whatever we spent, we could sign for, was paid for by the Japanese Army. So a couple of us guys got together. We invited about 50 people from Shanghai, almost off the street. We had this big banquet at the Palace Hotel. We had a great time, and we managed to get some good, real good booze out of the wine shop in the basement of the Palace Hotel. We had a great time. Fantastic. Then we flew into Tianjin. Tianjin at that time.
Was that picture fit into this part?
Yeah. We had this guy here, Gerald Labounty, was one of my closest buddies. And he had originally been a stenographer with a stenographer. Therefore, he did a lot of work for close-in work with General Geiger and other top officers. But when we went into China, Jerry had switched over to become a driver, and he was driving for Colonel Brown, who was the G2 officer. And since he had close connections with the top brass, he approached General Rocky at that time, who was our commanding general, and said, you know, he said, the colonels that we drive for, the 7 colonels that 7 of us drive for, all live in this one section off Racecourse Road in Tianjin. And he said, what we ought to do is we ought to find a house to occupy these 7, to put these 7 drivers in, so we can be close to where the colonels are. And he said, General Rocky said, well, you go find a place, and we'll do that. And so he finds the residence of the French ambassador and leases this three-story house. I think it had 23 rooms, and consequently, each of the 7 drivers had a suite in this house. We drew money to buy food. We also drew rations from the mess hall, and so we had a great life there. And this was 4 of us. Now, this was Jerry. And I just got to tell you just a little bit about Jerry.
Is this the house here?
This is the house behind it, and unfortunately, I don't have any good shots of the thing. And that was the only place that we could not find last year. When we visited China, we couldn't find it. We'll find it next time, because I believe it's still there.
Yeah.
But with Jerry, Jerry and I kind of kept in touch all through these years and everything. And 3 years ago, I called him up and I said, Jerry, I got you a round-trip ticket on United Airlines from Chicago to, he lived in Indiana. I said, I got you a round-trip ticket and you're coming to visit me for 3 weeks. And he balked and squawked and everything, and so I got in touch with his daughter, who had a little clout with him, and she said, "No way, Dad, you're going." That's awesome. So he came out east here for 3 weeks with us, and I took him down to, he was wheelchair bound. Yeah. I took him down to Washington, D.C. We visited all the World War II memorials, and then we went down to Quantico in the Marine Corps Museum, and spent the whole day there, and had lunch in the Toon Tavern in the museum, and just had a great time. Well, fast forward to current times. I had signed up to go to the reunion, the 23rd annual reunion of the China Marine Association, which is going to be held in Fredericksburg, Virginia, the 26th, 27th, 28th of August this year. And so I had signed up for that. Sally and I had planned to go down to that. And then I got a brainstorm. And I called Jerry's daughter. And I said, "Ruth, here's the game plan. This is what we're going to do. And this is what I want to do. I want to drive out to Peru, Indiana. Peru, Indiana. And pick up Jerry and take him down to the reunion. And then at the end of the reunion, we're going to drive to, we'll have a rental car. We'll drive to Dulles Airfield, and Sally and I are going to take off for Singapore, and we'll put him on a plane back to Chicago." And Ruth said, "Oh, gosh, that's wonderful. Can I go too?" And I said, "Oh, absolutely, wonderful, because you can look after Jerry then." And she said, "Well, that's the whole idea." So that was the game plan. A couple weeks ago, she called me. Jerry's gone. But he was, what a guy he was, a very close friend, and I said, "Well, thank God we brought him out here a couple of years ago, because at least we had that memory. That was great."
We've spoken about when you were there, you were involved in the surrender of the Japanese forces in North China.
Oh yeah,
Tianjin?
In Tianjin. And now, mind you, we arrived there on the 22nd of September, and our mission was to work with the Japanese to make arrangements for our troops to come in and lay some basic groundwork for the surrender, which was to take place, and eventually did take place on October the 6th. And we discovered very quickly that the only officer that we could, Japanese officer that we could do any business with, was a first lieutenant. And here was a first lieutenant who had been educated in the United States, and he was a very, very bright man, but he was negotiating and talking over terms with Brigadier General William A. Wharton, which was incredible. And when we moved into the, you guys see this one?
Yeah, let's do it.
Because this is the Astor Hotel. This is the original Astor Hotel, 3 stories high, in Tianjin, where we stayed when we first moved there, and when we first went in there. And this picture is from their museum in that hotel, and this picture is the hotel that they built behind the original structure, and and it's the real showpiece now. But they maintained the other one just like it was.
Yeah.
And last October, Sally and I went into that hotel, and we stood in what was the lobby area, and I said, I know this. I said, Sally, you're down the end of this hall. The last room on the left-hand side is a room that I occupied when we were here. Just opposite is the elevator. And Sally's, yeah, sure, I know. And we walked down there, and there is this elevator. The cage type, the old cage type, you know, wasn't operating at this point, but it was still there. And then there was the room that I had occupied. And we walked in there, and Sally took my picture and everything. And while we were there, I said, it's the room is not as deep as it was because there was a balcony out here before. And the young lady who was showing us around the hotel, helping us around the hotel, said, no, never a balcony there. No balcony there. And I said, no, there was a balcony. Because I sat on that balcony the day, the 30th of September, when the 6th Marine Division marched down this road in front of us, and there was, I was sitting on the balcony out there. And no balcony. Well, we got into as we were wandering around there, they see a little sign up there that says museum. And I said, museum? This is wonderful. I gotta get in there. And they said, well, we'll get somebody to get you in there. Well, this nice young lady got us in there. We wandered around. That's where Sally took this picture of General Rocky signing the surrender papers. Behind him is General Wharton, and behind him is General Crawford, the guy I went to China with. I told you I was going to say something more about Colonel Crawford. Yes. Colonel Crawford was Army. He had come over to the Marines a few years before, and and on some kind of an assignment having to do with, he was basically a finance officer, and somehow or other, Colonel Cummings, my colonel, had spotted this guy and said, I like this guy. And he had him assigned to the G1 section of the 3rd Amphibious Corps. And when he was parting, when Colonel Crawford was going back to the States, he turned over command to to Colonel Crawford, an Army colonel, bird colonel, and a great guy, a wonderful, wonderful guy. And when we got to Tin Sin, he said, you know, well, a couple things happened. First thing, General Wharton had 2 suites on the 2nd story of the Astor Hotel, and right above my one room, and with 2 suites, he had 2 bathrooms, and we came up with an idea. Said, well, you know, what are we going to do with these 10 cases of money, you know, and you store them in Tin Sin where? Yeah. So I think I came up with the idea. So why don't we put them in one of the bathrooms? So we took one of the bathrooms in the suite. We put the 10 cases of currency, and then the 6 enlisted men said, look, we got to provide around the clock security here. So we'll serve around the clock. We'll put a little desk out front opposite the elevator, and we will guard the place and act as receptionists for anybody coming up to visit the general. So that's what we did, and this lieutenant frequently came to visit the general, and was a very, very interesting man. Very intelligent, very smart. English was impeccable, and I spent a lot of time with him.
This was a Japanese lieutenant.
The Japanese lieutenant, because he would come up and and he would always be early, and the general invariably was could be delayed a little bit. So I'd have to sit down with the lieutenant and in his spare room, and we would chat. And he loved American cigarettes.
Of course.
And I always made a habit of leaving a pack of cigarettes and well, you know, you take those. I don't have any room for them, something like that. So we had a very, very interesting relationship. One incident now is amusing. You know, Japanese officers carried a revolver, where we had 45s.
Yeah.
And I always wanted one of these Colt 25s. So one day I said to the lieutenant, I said, you know, I would love to have one of those Colt 25s. And I wonder if I could get you to get one for me. I'd be glad to pay a carton of cigarettes for it. And the lieutenant said, would you like to look at the weapon? And I said, yeah, sure. So I was looking at it and everything, and looked it over and handed it back to him. And he took it and he put it to my temple.
Oh, sure.
And he said, you have just insulted the Japanese officer. And that is not a good thing to do. He said, now, you know, all of our officers are in seclusion. And that leaves me, the only one left. He said, I know what my life is worth. He said, so somebody will rub me out right after I blow your brains out. And I sat there and I said, what do I do? What do I do? And I had the brainchild. I said, look, pull the goddamn trigger or take that effing thing away from my head. And he did. Took it away from me. And he said, don't ever do that again. And I said, sir, I apologize. And I'm terribly sorry that I had the ill manners to insult an officer. And I will not ever do it again. And that was the beginning of a great relationship, because it could have been different. but imagine this guy, first lieutenant negotiating with him. The other thing which is worth mentioning, Colonel Crawford was very busy getting the barracks for 6,000 troops that we were going to bring in here on the 30th of September. And he was really up to his ears in that activity. So he said, hey, look, he said, we've got a couple activities that you and I are involved in. One is the barracks and everything. The other is kind of managing who's going to be coming into these hotels around town and everything. So you look after the hotels. You're in charge of the hotels. And the corporal is after the hotels. And one of the first assignments I had was the mayor of Shanghai would like to check into this hotel, but they won't check him in because they need your permission. And so I go over to the hotel and I meet the mayor of Shanghai and I say, I'll give him the best suite you have in the house, you know. And then I happened to run into this guy a couple times after that. He remembered that. And it was really interesting for a little corporal to do that. And one of the interesting things that happened to me was in Tien Sen was I was on my way to becoming a very rich man. They had a high forum, and it was a huge building with the hall for the high games and everything. And on the top of the building that it was housed in was a marvelous restaurant, one of the finest restaurants in Tien Sen. And I ate there, I dined there often. I had a car, I had access to certain alcoholic beverages, and it was easy to attract friends who would love to go with go for dinner. So we did a lot of partying. And General Dunkelberger, who took over from Colonel Crawford, who had taken over from Colonel Cummings, was very, very nice. He let me have the car an awful lot by myself. So we dined frequently at this restaurant. And after about the third time, the maitre d' in the restaurant said to me, he said, "I will not serve you again unless you promise that you will go to the highlight games, because I've been asking you to go to the games and you refuse to do it." He said, "I will not allow them to serve you if you don't go to the games." So I said, "Okay, I'll go after dinner." So after dinner, I went down there and I said, "Hi," and the man looked at me, he saw my 2 stripes, and he says, "What's your name, Corporal?" And I said, "Hook." And he says, "Follow me." And he took me to a box. And on the door to this little box is a brass plaque. It says, "Reserved for the private use of Corporal William W. Hook, U.S. Marine Corps." I said, "Wow." So we went in. Into the box, a friend of mine, another guy and myself. And we went into the box, and we ordered drinks, and the games were about to begin and everything, and the waiter came over and he said, "Do you know the game?" And I said, "No, never saw the game in my life." He says, "Well," he says, "you give me so much money and I'll go make the bets for you." There are 9 games in the series. And he says, you give me the money. It's about equivalent to about $100. So I give him the money. And he brings the tickets back and he puts them under the ashtray and he said, "You're no lucky till all games are over." Oh, okay. So the end of the games, we look at the tickets. Everyone was a winner. And I said, "Oh my God." I said, "Oh Lord, this is too much." I said, "But let's figure this out. This guy gets a tip, doesn't he?" So, and I did about $600. So I give him 300. And off we went. And the next morning, I was in the outer office waiting for the orders to take Colonel Dunkelberger to lunch or whatever he was going to do and everything, and there was a phone call for me. Said, "Chinese gentleman would like to have tea with you at this certain hotel." And so I went to the hotel, and I announced myself, and I hardly needed to announce myself. But I went in, and here is this very polished gentleman, Chinese gentleman, 3-piece suit, necktie, the whole 9 yards. I mean, really good. And he said, "You went to the games last night?" He says, "Well," he says, "you understand the rules very well." He says, "What I want you to do is to, I want you to go to the games 4 or 5 times a week, and you know the drill." He said, you already know that." He said, "And I want you to bet a certain amount of money every night, and after the troops arrive, after your troops arrive, I'll give you the new numbers of how much to bet." And I said, "Okay, fine." So for a relatively short period, I was rolling in big money, which I was sending back to the States. And I don't know, shortly after our troops got there, it wasn't too long, General Rocky somehow got the idea that these games might be fixed or something, so he closed the whole damn thing down. that was the end of my fortune.
Yeah, I mentioned that the date you saw in the museum for the actual surrender, we spoke the last time we were here, was wrong. You want to just tell us about the surrender itself, the present Japanese... When we went, Sally and I had been to Tianjin once before, a couple of years ago, and we couldn't find anything. And this time, the last October, we went, and we happened to find the office building that we had occupied in 1945. It was still intact, a beautiful building. And across from it was the surrender site. And we saw that too. And but that's all we could find. That's all we could find. And we said we've got to get somebody to drive us around town and show us some of the places that I want to find. So we ended up at a Chinese tourist office and state tourist office, and said we need to have somebody escort us. And there's nobody available. So we don't do that kind of thing. And then she said, "Well, now wait a minute, I may know a guy." So she called some man, and he said, "Yeah, he'd be glad to take you around, fee and everything." So this very fine guy comes along, and he's got this big car, and Sally speaks Chinese, so we're riding around, and I said, I want to find that house. I got to find that house. And we looked and we looked and we looked and looked. And he was a great guy. Tianjin is undergoing this massive change, with high-rise buildings. The largest hospital in the world is in Tianjin. And these high-rise buildings, we saw one building going over, we couldn't see the top of it. It was unbelievable. But anyway, this guy's showing us all around the old sections that are still intact. And we went back to the office building and the surrender site, and we had exhausted we found the barracks where most of the Marines had stayed while we were there, and we were riding down this street looking for whatever we could find, the old sections, and I see this building, and I said, "Stop the car! Is this still a hotel?" And he says, "Yeah." He says, "This is the Astor Hotel." He says, "But we can't enter it here. We'll have to go around the backside." So we go around the backside to this part here, and we go into the hotel. And I said, "I got to go in the old section." They showed us the way in, and that's how we got in there. And they had this museum. There's in China,
there's not much information, because when the communists took over in 1949, they destroyed anything they could with Chiang Kai-shek's label on it, you know. But this hotel was built in 1863 by the British, and I don't know who owns it today, but they stubbornly have their own museum in there, which is filled with stuff going all the way back to 1863, and that's where we found the information on these two posters on the surrender side. And unfortunately, we were booked on a train back to Beijing, and we ran out of time, so we're going to spend a week there this coming October.
You say
so where?
The date was wrong, you said.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first we went to we had an appointment with at the embassy, U.S. Embassy in Beijing, and we were telling them what we had just been through. They knew nothing about the surrender of North China, nothing. But they said, "Oh, we need the information that you have." So I said, "Oh, great, you know, this is fine." And I'm in contact constantly with the embassy now. But then we came back from there, and we flew back into Washington, and said, "Well, let's go down to the Marine Corps Museum." So we go down to the Marine Corps Museum, and we wander around looking. Well, what about the surrender of North China? And there are 3 lines on the wall with wrong date. And I did talk to some of the Marines there, and I said, you know, this is it. And they said, you need to talk to the Marine Corps Heritage Foundation, which sponsors the museum, which I'm a member of, and and they'll be delighted to hear what you got to say. So shortly I'm going to be going down that way, and I'll be talking to the folks in the Marine Corps Museum, tell them what I'm up to, and also with the the Marine Corps Heritage Foundation, talk to them too.
Get them squared away.
Yeah. And they're very interested.
Now, can you tell us when you came out of the service and you came back to the States? How'd that go? What happened?
Well, you know, I went into the service with 8 years of schooling. I went in before high school. So when I came out of the service, I went back to high school briefly at night, and I ended up getting a GED, and I enrolled in Wilmington College, which is now part of the University of North Carolina. And
so you were still in the Marines, huh?
No, I was discharged in March of 1946. And I was living in North Carolina. And I went to Wilmington College, and after 1 year in college, I was working going to college and working at JCPenney's in Wilmington, and hoping to get a college degree. And what happened? I get recalled in the Marine Corps because I was in the inactive reserve, and so I got recalled and back to. Back in the Marine Corps. But at the time I was married, had 3 small children, and I was still corporal. And they said, you know, you can get a dependency discharge, so I took it. And I went to work for a number of different things, but I ended up getting bluffing my way with no real education into the IBM Corporation as a clerk in the branch office. And I was so delighted to get the opportunity to work for that corporation, because in those days it was one of the most respected organizations in the world, and I had a 27-year career with IBM. Shortly after I got into IBM, I went in as a clerk in a branch office, and I eventually became office manager, which became administration manager, and I was must have been good at managing because I got tapped to go into management development, and from there on, I spent the rest of my career in working with developing managers in the corporation, and when I retired in 1981 from IBM, my boss said, you know, he said, if you look at titles and salaries and stuff like that, you know, you're in the top 5% of the IBM corporation. And I said, I can't believe it. So I had a great career. I tried to retire a couple times. I ended up working with Philip Crosby Associates in quality management for a number of years, which was another great career.
Yeah.
And I lived in Singapore at the time, and I started a company for Philip Crosby Associates there, and I was the president of Crosby Associates Asia Pacific for a number of years, and then I retired from that organization, and we moved back to the United States in 1999, and I was a little bit restless, and I ended up doing a lot of skiing, and I'd go over to Vermont to ski, and we were living around Albany, and I'd go over to Bromley Mountain Ski Resort, and I ended up there for 10 years as the head cashier for the company, and this is a portrait they did this past around the end of the season. The guy who did that was smart enough. He took all the skiers out. And
I don't know if you can read it, but they gave you some rank. You're captain.
Well, that came about way back in my IBM career, and some guy nailed me with Captain Brook, you know, the guy, and it stuck. It stuck all these years.
And now you're interested in continuing your pursuit of history and writing your story?
Yeah, since there was so little information available about the surrender of North China, I decided that I was going to put some stuff together. A very interesting sideline here is that in 1973, when I was working with IBM, I traveled to Australia a great deal. I happened to meet a guy on an airplane one time, and we got to talking about China. He said, my secretary is from China. I said, well, I used to associate with the Russian community, and Chinese, my secretary is Russian. And lo and behold, she knew me. I didn't know her, she knew me. Next trip I went back to Australia, I met her, and she reunited me with a lady that I had known in China, who was some kind of my surrogate mother when I was in China, and she introduced me to a lady whose name is Joan Stanberry. She was Miss Australia 1959, and we immediately became good friends. And as I traveled around a bit, and when Sally came into my life, and we traveled to Australia, Sally would stay at Joan's house, and they became good friends. So here we had this marvelous relationship and everything. And Joan is a journalist, and when she visited us last June over here, and we took her all around New England, and had a great great trip all around New England. And she came back to my computer, and she sat down at my computer, and she framed out 9 chapters of the book that I'm writing about North China and essentially the entire Marine Corps history in China, which is fascinating.
Well, I think we, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Joan's editing the book.
Good.
And she's going to China with us in October.
Well, thank you very much for
Thank you.
joining us here, and thank you for your service to the Marine Corps.
Thank you. My pleasure. I kind of felt that I got a graduate degree in the Marine Corps.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.